So I'm writing a novel. Is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also answer listener questions and sometimes, actually quite frequently recently, interview people who write fiction. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with one of the hosts of the Appendix N Book Club podcast, Vinh-Hoi. Along with his co-host, Jeff Goad, Hoi has recorded over 100 episodes of the Appendix N Book Club. I've brought them up on this podcast a few times, in no small part because, frankly, they were part of the inspiration for me to go ahead with, so I'm writing a novel. What is the Appendix N reading list? Well, the Appendix N reading list, you will find it at the back of the 1979 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. It is a list of authors and their works that Gary Gygax says inspired him when he was co-creating Dungeons & Dragons. If you don't happen to have that book handy, I've also linked to it in the show notes for today's episode. In roughly the first half of an hour-long episode, Jeff, Hoi, and a guest will discuss the story and literary merits of the book, and in the back half, roughly, they will discuss how elements of the book can be torn out and put into your tabletop role-playing game experience, whether it's Dungeons & Dragons or any number of other games that might be relevant. I've enjoyed many of the episodes about books that were not sword and sorcery. However, many Appendix N texts are sword and sorcery, and I have gotten a lot of valuable research as well as just straight up enjoyment from listening to their show, which is why I was delighted to be a guest back in the spring. I'll link to that episode in the show notes for this, if you want to check it out. This isn't about me, though. This is about Hoi. Let's get talking to that man. That wonderful, wonderful man. And here I am with Hoi. Hello, Hoi.
Hi, Oliver. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's so fun to see you, man. I've been looking forward to this. Okay, so let's just barrel right into the questions. Why not?
Sure.
I'm curious, what do you do when you're not reading and thinking about speculative fiction? I know basically nothing about you outside that world. Maybe you prefer it that way. We can move on, but yeah.
No. I mean, I have a day job like lots of people, and my fantasy is I do not have the fantasy, unlike many people, of being in full-time in gaming or anything like that. I think that to a certain extent, this whole thing about like doing what you love, you should like what you do, but doing what you love, the thing that you're most passionate about, I think that's a good recipe for some people, maybe not for everybody, to really kill that love. And so, I have a decent day job, could always be better. Speculative fiction is just, I'm a compulsive, like, if you put a cereal box in front of me, my eyes will just start scanning it. So I go in waves. There was about maybe a 10-year period where I was really focused on crime fiction of various sorts. Anything about any kind of history other than, say, 19th century European history will like tweak me, and I'll be like, oh, I got, and there's just any topic, and I know I won't get through the history books. And the problem I think with history books that we have lost is the narrative aspect of history. We know that history is very complex and it can't be reduced to little sound bites, but popular history is maybe a skill that's been lost, I think, or maybe that's why journalists do it now and not academics, So history, newspaper, speculative fiction, absolutely. Gaming books, film and media. Comic books, not as much. I kind of gave that up about 10 years ago just because I ran out of space in my apartment.
Yeah, floppies in particular take up a lot of room. I've got a bunch of half boxes I'm trying to figure out what to do with.
Yeah. The Kindle was a big savior, although this project really ruined me because I was all set to just keep on reading on Kindle. And then Jeff roped me into this project. And now I have I think 300 or 400 paperbacks that actually I have at least bookshelves in my office at work, so I keep them all there instead of here at home. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's funny because that was actually going to be my next question because like collecting old Appendix N paperbacks is fun. I stopped collecting comics years ago, and then because of your wretched podcast, I have that part of my brain just switched over to old Appendix N paperbacks now. So I'm just collecting those. I have multiple editions of some things. Why? But it is sometimes necessary to read the stories, right? Depending on availability. And I know Jeff loves to acquire, then ruthlessly defile them. But it sounds like you also been collecting them.
Yeah, I do not defile. I'm a big believer in, it's just that golden age illustration. Everything now is very polished, but you can see a lot of it is photo reference or Photoshop. And it's still way beyond like the skills that I could ever aspire to. But I think you lose a little something in translation, when you don't see Frazetta. Frazetta's giant, but even some of the lesser lights of the era, they're facility with line and all that is incredible. And I don't think we see that as much now. It's more just like hero poses. Here's the main character, or then it goes too far in the other direction where it's like the action is impossible, right? It's like swirling mists and people flying through the air. It's very wuxia, as opposed to Conan fighting the frost giants, the two frost giants, and that beautiful sort of almost Himalayan landscape behind them, right?
Yeah. I mean, I should be so lucky to get a book published and have one of those covers, but I do think there's a bit of fatigue among a lot of fans of genre stuff, in particular fantasy, with the sort of almost like D&D 5th Ed house style.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, very photoshopped. Just like vaguely painterly style. When the entire shelf of the bookstore is looking like that, it's hard to get excited. But then you go back to these older things and there's that greater variety, right? Even if some of it can be clunkier or whatever, or technically less proficient in some cases, it has got more maybe personality.
And that's probably the same reason why I like sort of the black and white line art that was the interior of gaming books, as opposed to, again, that very polished. Again, I don't take anything away from it. I just think that everything should be in sort of a ration diet of this thing and then that thing. Again, it's not a proficiency I could never aspire to. So that's why I never became a visual artist. I can take photographs, for here and there, but not as a visual artist. So,
oh, fair enough. Well, overexposure, if anything, is too much. Like, I don't mind an IPA, but 3/4 of the shelves in my beer store is all IPAs.
Forget about it. Forget about it. Like for that very reason, I've only been drinking like pilsners for like the last year and a half.
Okay, so what is the origin story of the Appendix N Book Club? How was it born?
Okay. It's a 2-stage, so if it gets too long, just edit this out. But I hadn't been gaming for a long time, although I kept on buying gaming books and gaming texts, both in book and PDF form. And then sort of Lamentations of the Flame Princess is the one that sort of got me back a little bit into thinking about old school Dungeons and Dragons, because I had that very, cosmic horror vibe and what have you. And then Free RPG Day came up. I don't know if that's a thing that they have in Canada or not.
We do it.
Yep. So sort of promotional day for, the handout stuff. So I was in line, not even at my regular game store. It was another game store in Brooklyn. Decided to go to Free RPG Day. And then Jeff was there in line. And we started talking a little bit. But this did not actually become the origin of the book club right away. So we just saw each other and like, oh, okay, hey, nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah. I didn't even play the game with him that day. And then about a year later, I started, I saw like DCC was on sale. So I bought a copy of DCC. Oh, this is kind of exciting. And then I saw that there was a DCC meetup group. And I was looking at these sessions and, oh, that looks great. Couldn't get into any of the games because the first 2 or 3 games had been subscribed. But then he had said, oh, I want to do a book club. So I went to the book club. And I think there was a couple other people, but I was the only one who was going there kind of regularly. So a couple times it was just me and Jeff when we were talking about, I think it was about 4 or 5 sessions that we talked about stuff. And then he said, I kind of want to do something with this. I don't know what, like a blog or something like that. And I don't remember if it was he or I who suggested, like, why don't we just do a podcast? Because everybody's, about to have one right now. I happen to have an audio studio at work or a bunch of audio studios at work at my university. And so we just popped down there with a microphone and a digital recorder and just did it really on the rough. Oh, actually on my laptop originally, very on the rough to begin with. And, we talked about it for a while. And then when we got sort of we had our little mission statement about how we love this, but we do not want to cater to the most regressive elements of the fandom.
I was talking to Matt John from Rogues in the House on Thursday in my time, by this point, who knows, about this. And we got into a little bit about the regressive element and how we could outshine them maybe by inflating the progressive.
Right. And to be fair, I mean, some of that awareness of Appendix N was by some of the, there's a combination, there's a spectrum. I mean, there are people who I'm quite, I've talked to, I think very highly of, who are sort of closer to the more sort of conservative end, and actually are maybe in communication with the people who are at what I would consider the regressive end, but they are also equally in communication with our end. So I respect that. And so again, some of that element that was the regressive was the people who sort of brought that back in the fore and said, hey, we should be reconsidering this, or or at least for them, I think it was more of a question of visibility rather than sort of reanalyzing or looking at this, right? Again, what I'll call the conservative faction of people who are into sword and sorcery, right? It's like, oh, we just want the visibility of it. It's not so much that we're talking about like breaking it down. What does it mean? And how can it be relevant in this day and age, right? It's just like, we should never have forgotten about it in the first place. Okay.
Yeah, less so about critical thought, more about just enjoyment and making sure it doesn't fade away.
And again, that's completely, it's very, very important. And so we had that, and we were talking, and we did about, say, 20 episodes or so, and then it was like, hey, we sort of know people. Jeff has already been doing these spell burn. It's like, maybe we get some third perspectives on this. So we started with a smaller circle that was sort of the DCC spell burn circle, or people who know out of that, and some artists and whatever. And I'm really surprised and shocked that we've managed to get some people. Jeanette Ng, who won the World Fantasy Award, came on the show. Obviously the biggest coup was Michael Moorcock, and that took a while to do. And it was an amazing conversation. I wish we'd just been a little bit more technically proficient at the time. But and all along the way, we've just met amazing, really interesting people from all over the world so far. Unfortunately, mostly in the Anglo sphere, obviously, because of the nature of the literature we're working from. And I've been looking at stuff, again, I don't know anything that's non-English, but at least stuff that is from broader cultural perspectives. MRO is an obvious example. Mm-hmm. We're both fans of Angeline Adams and Remco van Straten, their work there. So, and there's a couple others. So I'm kind of keeping my eyes open for that. So yeah, that's for lack of a better word, the origin. It was sort of fairly organic, I guess.
Yeah, well, that's cool. And I like that it came out of your friendship and all that. Yeah, no, that's a really nice story for how it came about. Mm-hmm. Actually, something you mentioned to me when we were chatting about this a little in advance was how in the first 20 episodes or so of the Appendix N podcast, you wrote some really thorough show notes, flush with links to further reading and gaming resources, as well as a basic rundown on the history of the book itself. Then the show notes got a lot simpler and have stayed that way. I'm curious, and I sympathize, don't get me wrong, what are your experiences as a podcaster, but also as a listener of podcasts with show notes? Do you feel anybody reads these things or what?
I think we did at the early on. I do. The ones that constant, the big 800-pound gorilla in the gaming world is Ken and Robin, right? Ken and Robin talk about stuff. And so I've found links to all sorts of incredible media through them. So they have pretty extensive show notes. I think they're big enough that they might actually have someone who's sort of, on their Patreon who's like helping compile the show notes. So I really appreciate that as a resource. The other show, for example, The Good Friends of Jackson Elias, which is focused on cosmic horror and Call of Cthulhu, they have very good show notes as well. So I wish I could still do it. It's just the nature of like, I'm not doing this full time. So, and it takes me over a day to do, one set of show notes for an episode. So, at that time, life was a little simpler, and I could do it.
I think that's also just a life cycle with these kinds of projects where the person is figuring out how much work works for them in their life, but you're also super enthusiastic in the first bunch, and so they'll tend to be maybe a little more. I suspect the day is coming when I will be a little less thorough in how I do this. We were talking about editing. I'm going to leave some ums in at some point or another.
Right. I do want to backfill some of those. I always think, that's an interesting thing I learned about, I don't know, Margaret St. Clair or something like that. And maybe people would be interested in doing that, knowing that. But sometimes you just have to leave things out of the wayside so to keep the momentum going. And that's another reason why our episodes are really only an hour. And in fact, we don't record like 2 hours of material. You're not missing 2 hours of material for our 1 hour episode. Maybe it's like 4 or 5 minutes on top of that. Just because, as amazing as it would be to continue those conversations, we kind of want to leave something on the table so that, that the energy level is still there. So
yeah. Plus, like I've listened to sort of like 3 hour long podcasts once in a blue moon, and they're fun, but you can't listen to them in one sitting, not easily. Right. And also, exactly, the energy can kind of flag on the back end, or maybe the whole energy is just like dudes sitting around hanging out, which is not really the same thing as what you might want out of a show you're listening to necessarily, right. Unless it's like a goofy comedy one, in which case, yeah, sure, whatever. But yeah, I really like the tone and pacing of the Appendix N Book Club podcast. Right. I think you made a good call there. And at this point, it's been going a little while. I missed some story in your origin story there. What year did this begin?
I want to say it was 2016. I know we were doing it by 2017, and we may have started the book club as a reality. Might have been early in 2017. I think it's when we started doing this, or the beginning of summer of 2017.
Okay.
Yeah.
And by now you've had over 100 guests, I think, on at this point.
80 some odd guests, and 105 episodes, I think, are in the can.
Right. Sorry, I'm getting confused because I did go back and listen to the early ones, but I've of course been mostly listening to everything past that, so my brain just backfilled. And like everything has a guest. You're right. You're right. Guests came in later.
Yeah.
But still, many guests.
Mhm.
I'm curious, what do you feel makes a strong guest, and why was I the best one you've ever had?
Well, Oliver, I mean, it goes without saying that, our fine civilized neighbors to the north are always going to be great guests. What makes a good guest? Because it's kind of random. We don't always sort the guests with the text, especially now that we are having our listeners vote on the text. I think a lot of times it was just like, here's people that we want to talk to regardless, or at least that's the impression I get from the ones that Jeff has picked up on that I hadn't necessarily heard of. And I pick a lot of people I put on the suggestion list just because I think they are interesting already. Pitched, one of our early guests was Fletcher Vredenberg, who's a contributor to Blackgate. And he'd written a lot about historical fiction and swords and sorcery, but actually he wrote a piece that I just really, really liked about his friendship with a young man in Staten Island when they were growing up, and that they had fallen out of contact with each other and then had briefly come back in contact, I think through the death of a relative or something like that. And it was just incredibly moving piece. And, he was in Staten Island. So I said, at that point we weren't remote yet. So he actually came to this, the studio to do, and he was incredibly gracious. And he still writes a lot on Blackgate. And I think his own blog is swordssorcery.blogspot or something like that. So that was great. We've had some really, we always like to tell the story about how we have strive for the worst possible fit between guest and fiction. And so that was probably Fletcher Pratt's the Unicorn. We had Strix Beltran, who was a very well-known both video game designer, and she was the co-designer of Bluebeard's Daughter. Bluebeard's Daughter? I think that's the title of the game. And that's a very problematic book, both from what's in the content and just actually being able to read it. The text, I don't deny Fletcher Pratt's a good writer, but he's difficult to read. And she thought we were trolling her. And she actually had her, when she was reading, she actually had her assistant look us up and find us. And they said, no, they're legit, they're real. and it turned out to be one of the best episodes we did up to that point. So I'm not really sure. I think that I think just the fact of them being willing to engage, and from my standpoint, I really just, I worked sort of peripherally in documentary production for a while. I just really always want to learn something every minute of the day. And so when I have the guest on, I want to know what they're about, or what they think. And so sometimes more to that than to the extent of like what's in the text. Like Jeff likes to say it's a cliche question, like what's your secret origin story with fantastic fiction or how you got into gaming, but I'm genuinely interested. I'm like, and I mean, he is too. I'm just saying he likes to phrase it as the cliche question because I think he thinks it's fairly routine, but I think that, or to ask it is fairly routine, but I think all the answers have been great. Have been really fascinating in terms of the context of how a lot of people came into gaming, what fiction meant to them, when they were younger. So, that's what I think. Anyone who's willing to engage past this, I liked it, I didn't like it, or I didn't like it, but because of this, or so such is the nature, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And actually, I will say I always enjoy that question at the beginning of your podcast. I think it's a really good, get into the pool kind of, sort of thing. And you know what? Damn it. I meant to ask you that first too. I was going to steal your question and put it back to you. So you've reminded me. Thank you. Well, what was your origin story with spec fic and gaming?
Okay. Spec fic. So, I mean, I've always read, as a kid, read everything. So fairy tales, whatever. I would say before I read The Hobbit or anything like that, I had my first and second grade teacher was Swedish, and she had us read the Dolaire's Norse Myths and Gods, or Norse Gods and Myths book from the late 60s, which have these incredible illustrations of all the Norse myths, Thor with incredibly red beard, and it was done in very sort of not the superhero style, so that really beautiful sort of I'm not sure what medium they're working with. It's not just watercolor, pen and ink, watercolor. They did a Greek myths book, which is still in print. And so that was probably my early fantasy fiction. C.S. Lewis, certainly Lloyd Alexander. And then I think around third grade or so, that's when the Rankin and Bass, not Rankin and Bass. Rankin and Bass Hobbit animation. Yeah, that came out, and so that was incredible. And then someone got me the Hobbit. So it's not not particularly unique origin story there. And then at some point later on, so I started reading that. D&D came in there somewhere in there as well. I think around third or fourth grade, D&D started showing up. And then at that point, my father had a publishing deal with Random House, which was the distributor of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardcover. So he went to visit his editor in New York at one point, and so we were just tagging along, sitting outside the office, and then the editor came out and he goes, "Oh, yeah, do you want to? I have something you might like." And he gave me and my sister the 3 hardcovers, the original AD&D hardcovers, which I have somewhere to this day. They're buried under, like, my aunt has since moved into the house that we used to live in, so it's probably under like 3 generations worth of other stuff. So that's how I got. I mean, I'd already been playing D&D, but that's how I got my first AD&D materials. Somewhere in there, I got the blue box, though. I think my parents bought the blue box, the Holmes blue box, at the time when they ran out of dice. So you had the little chits, the little. You had to cut. So that's D&D, and then through that, I discovered, and then later with Deities and Demigods, that's how I discovered a bunch of the Appendix N authors, H.P. Lovecraft, and the like. So I think H.P. Lovecraft, I was visiting the family that had put up my father when he first came to the States in high school, and his stepbrother had a copy of the Lancer Color Out of Space. So that's the first Lovecraft story I read, and that freaked me the F out.
That's a good start. That's a good start. Yeah.
Somewhere in there, one of those trips, someone gave me a copy of I think it was one of the Kane books, the Carl Edward Wagner one. And also my mom at one point, was working in New York during the week and came back to Boston, and she had bought me a copy of the Ace Conan, the one with him fighting the Red Ape on the cover.
Yes, the very first one, the first volume. Good.
Yeah.
Get there.
Yeah, so all that, and I had the not as fortunate as you, Oliver, in terms of having access, but it had a really amazing library systems when I was growing up in Boston. So just stuff would be, I'd pick stuff, or sometimes my parents would just like, take my sister to the library. She's about 4 years younger, and they would just grab 3 or 4 books that were on the shelf and bring them back. So yeah, there you go, everything.
Cool, yeah, and I'm curious. I know it was a while ago, but do you remember if that illustration of Thor you mentioned, did he have kind of like more of a strongman, big belly, or did he have more like the cut model muscles?
Right. This is the controversy that's been going on the web. He didn't have the round belly, but he's definitely square. He's definitely square in his torso. He never had like you never see his biceps because he had that sort of like that Viking tunic, like a green Viking tunic. So it was.
Yeah, but he looked like he's had a glass of water today. Yeah.
Exactly. He's not prepping for getting up there and flexing and getting caught and stuff like that. Yeah, he's
That's
definitely.
All I ask. I just want body positivity in my Thors.
Yeah. Bushy eyebrows, the whole works. So
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, so you have been reading and thinking critically about genre fiction for a while now. I imagine even before the podcast, but certainly with the podcast. And I something I worry about with myself, because I have met a non-zero amount of other people who do this. I'm sure you have too. You meet people who, God, they read so much. They read more than you, the royal you here, by a huge amount. And yet, then when you see their writing or you listen to them speak about genre, and you're like, did you learn anything from the 700 books you read this year? I mean, I'm not trying to be judgy, but just it's sort of, they'll have this very surface take, and you're like, God damn. And then I worry anyway. I look inward and I go, crap, is that me? Because I've been doing all this reading and research for my novel and other stuff. And then I'm just, God, am I actually thinking critically, or am I just going to go in wee and then coming out the other end and trying to make like a bad photocopy of the thing, right? So all this comes to me asking, do you have any advice for people who are trying to think more critically when reading genre fiction?
Well, I guess the big question is always whether you're thinking about questions of form or you're thinking about questions of. I don't want to separate from form and substance. They're not like totally separable things. But whether you're thinking about questions of form, emulation. I mean, that's a big problem in the gaming world, right? Everything is like, oh, we want to emulate this thing. I said, is that enough? Right? I mean, that's your first enthusiasm usually, maybe, but is it enough? So even when we're talking about like half of our episodes, usually talk about like, what would we yoink from a specific text for use in our gaming? but one would hope it would be transformative, right? Now, I don't think the novelty for its own sake, like, oh, we just have to put a twist on everything, is necessarily a desired thing to go through. So maybe the answer is that you do actually have to work through, you have to recapitulate what you know before you can then add to it and go beyond it. I mean, if we look at Picasso early on, his stuff is relatively, anatomically standard. He could do all that stuff before he moved on from that stuff. So with regards to swords and sorcery, there's a lot to unpack with swords and sorcery. I think the easy thing, and I was just thinking about it today, is that I would say it's fair to say that generally in fantasy fiction these days, at least half of the authors are women, especially in YA. Maybe it's 3/4 are women, people of color. But that sword and sorcery is probably still 80% plus men, right?
Yeah, and like a lot of bald white guys in black t-shirts, of which I'm one of them.
Right. Which again, it's fine. But I was noticing that also to a certain extent, it is like, I don't see that many people who come into sword and sorcery. Let's say that they're middle-aged now, right? It was still an enthusiasm that they had from when they were adolescents, right? You don't see too many people who are like, oh, I've been working in many genres and up till now, and then suddenly, whatever they are, people who are very, diverse in their types of the scope of their writing, and suddenly they walk in. You don't see like George R.R. would suddenly say, I want to write a sword and sorcery book today. Right? So I think that there's a primal appeal that locks in fairly early on with sword and sorcery. Now, it could be that the nature of what we've seen in sword and sorcery is then felt rightfully or wrongfully as being potentially exclusionary, and so that's why people of color, women, LGBT people have been somewhat underrepresented in terms of writing sword and sorcery up till now. That's changing, obviously. Again, I do want to mention, cite Angeline Adams, Cora Bullard, who we both know. I don't know if she's wrote specifically sword and sorcery, but she's very versed in it.
I believe she has. I think I saw her selling a short story the other day.
Yeah. Obviously, looming all over this is Charles Saunders. I do want to actually mention a writer I just has been on my list, and I just started reading his books about the beginning of the month. It's a Filipino writer named Daryl Quiog, I think. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He's got a phenomenal book, and I hope he pushes more, called Swords of the Four Winds, and it's Asian-influenced sword and sorcery. He's definitely, you can tell he's definitely a big reader of Harold Lamb.
Good call.
But the first half, I think, is sort of a Mongolian, Central Asian character, but he has Filipino-based characters. He's, so far, I've only read 2 stories of his, but tremendous. So I've kind of lost track of your question here, but okay, what is the problem? Have you learned anything?
Yeah, like how, sort of when people are trying to think more critically, because I worry sometimes that like I'm taking in like plot and character and theme, but then maybe am I thinking at all about the actual sentences? Like right now, I'm really trying to break down Liber. I find there's lots of writing about his character and themes and so on, but very little about like his actual sentence structures, like what are his rhetorical things. I find he likes to do those. What are they called? Homeric epithets, right? Like the wine dark sea. He likes to do those. So yeah, just like how do you shake yourself out of your normal headspace to try and see things that
that's a good question. Reading? I'm terribly stiff writer, whether that's why I don't love a lot of fiction. How do we do it? Some of it is rhetorical flourishes, and that is a good question, because it can feel like someone else's coat when you're putting them on. Right, like it might be the right size, but it's a little scratchy, right? So I don't know, some of that is maybe something you just have to work through and write, and then it'll eventually take the form that it needs to reflect you while paying homage to the thing that it is that you are so admire, right? But I'm also never been one that's very good at analyzing those things that you just talked about, the actual sentence structure, rhetorical flourish. I know when I don't like something, I can look at it and say that scan's wrong, or somehow. But also plot and theme, I'm also not as concerned about either. I just want to get surprised, like it's surprising. Actually, we can talk more about what the definition of sword and sorcery is. Brian Murphy just had another good piece on that recently. I think it's posted yesterday. But let's see. Well, I guess it depends on what you think maybe we do need to sort of think about like what is sword and sorcery, at least in the very broad term, and then say, well, why are we doing this, right? Are we vicariously wanting to emulate a certain kind of heroism, and that's the thing that's getting us? Are we talking about a fallen world and people just trying to make their way through it, but in a sort of more visceral way rather than just like, the way that Fafford and the Mouser do? And what kind of characters we have. So you had that discussion with Harold Andrew Jones the other week about what he calls pulp characters, right? Mm-hmm. Versus, and you're talking about the arc of Vaux's life here in the novel that you're trying to, you're working on right now. Your fellow Torontonian, Robin D. Laws, who does the Ken and Robin podcast, he has a thing. I don't know if he coined the term, but I heard it through him. So he divides characters, heroic characters, into iconic heroes and dramatic heroes. And I think that the last 30 or 40 years, people have been obsessed with dramatic heroes to the point where they misunderstand and they take iconic heroes and try to put them in the dramatic mode. So what Robin D. Laws defines as dramatic hero is what most people would understand. A character who develops, changes, maybe they have an origin story, and, they go through the whole act. And, sometimes the people tie that in with the Joseph Campbell, the
hero's journey,
stuff like that. Whereas the iconic character is defined as a character who, by remaining true to themselves, puts the world to rights. So that is Sherlock Holmes, Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name, James Bond, Batman.
Good old Conan, I figure.
Good old Conan. Yeah, Conan's a perfect example. It's because we don't really care. Yeah, Conan comes from Samaria, but we don't care how Conan became the toughest of all tough people, right? That's, but what has happened is, this is why like Hollywood can only ever do origin movies with superheroes, because they only understand, because if it's so much into, writers' workshops that are influenced. What's the guy who does all those screenwriters' workshops?
Robert McKee. Yeah.
Right. So they've been so locked into the idea of dramatic arcs that the only dramatic arc Batman has is his origin story. After that, he becomes an iconic character, right? And he's just Batman, right? Superman is not a dramatic character. Superman should never be in doubt. Superman is Superman. He's the best of us. He represents the best about,
and the funny thing with Batman is they keep trying to have their cake and eat it too, because they're like, well, he's a little older now, and now he's got a third Robin, now he's got a fourth Robin. And you're like, how old is he now? If the first one was, so... But that's what the problem also with never-ending stories, I guess.
Right.
Trying to have both dramatic and iconic.
So, I mean, what I'm guessing at, looking about what you've discussed so far on this show about Vaux, is that she is a dramatic character until she becomes an iconic character, and this is that arc of that first book, right? And then she becomes the immortal Vaux with her, 35-pound Warhammer.
I haven't decided how anime that thing is yet in terms of the shoe size.
Right. But
I mean, it's this kind of thing where, very much I'm mostly trained in screenwriting, which is everything you've described. And so I do tend to think of like, well, she's got to change over the whole book, and she's got to change each story. And this book is the tale of her like adventuring career. But I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. I want each story to stand alone on its own, so that theoretically I can have the fantasy of having been, say, a Leiber or a Howard, or maybe not Howard, but a Leiber or a Moorcock, who wrote a bunch of short stories that sold individually and then later decided to string them together. But now I can have the advantage of stringing them together on purpose.
Right.
So I think there's almost a bit of like, it's not just me enjoying thinking about being Vaux, it's me enjoying thinking about being one of those authors during the era where it was actually plausible to make a living writing short stories.
Right. and that's been the great joy of this project, is going back and reading short stories, as opposed to long novels. Someone, again, I can't remember who this was. Maybe it was, they started a project called 52 Stories, which is basically read 52 short stories in a year.
Okay.
Theoretically one a week, but that's not, I tend to read in bursts. So, but being able to read short stories, and now I feel like, I've heard this short story. I feel like I'm obligated to read this entire book if I've heard about one short story that I really need to read. So I'll just dive in and read that one short story, and then, surface right out of there. Or start like with the exemplar short story. So back to Leiber and Moorcock for a bit. It's interesting you mentioned this, because Leiber short stories, he does ultimately do an origin story for Mouser, and we all know it's the weakest story in the,
pretty much until
the stories when they're old men on Rime Isle.
Those were
Fafford's,
so uneven. They make it
right.
hard for me to recommend library because I'm like, well, the characters get older, which is cool. And those 2 books, sorry, I could go off, but I got opinions about that.
Yeah. But Fafford's origin story is pretty good, and I think the thing is that maybe he had those in his mind, but it's not good to. But it's that he did not write them first, right? He backfilled there.
Well, and Mouser's story was something else that he just reskinned, if I remember correctly.
And there is another short little Mouser origin story that I can't remember if it was Libro or Harry Otto Fisher wrote, and it was in Dragon magazine, right? Which is after Mouser has come to the city, and so that's kind of, and he's like a pimp and all these other things. And actually, Moorcock started at the end too, right? So he started basically, and then he sort of backfilled. Although Moorcock had the advantage of sort of coming into his prime just as he was ready to reapproach Elric at Elric's earlier adventures. So that it's funny that you read the earlier Elric adventures and they're much more mature prose. And the early Elric is less emo than the end Elric, which is kind of...
Yeah, no, I thought you guys nailed it in your excellent episode on Elric of Melniboné. Yeah, exactly. You have this sort of angry young man story of Stormbringer, which is the end. And then you go back to, exactly what you just said. Yeah, it's great.
Right. And I guess the other thing that we were thinking about is potentially the... again, I haven't read the actual text, but that theory of sort of the anxiety of influence, that you have to either destroy your influence or be destroyed by it, and so as a creative at least, right? And so maybe that's what you're wrestling with, and some people are perfectly content never to go past that, and that's the Lynn Carters of the world, and and the Elk.
Speaking of unnecessary origin stories, of course, the stuff he's added, he and the camp added there.
right, and I think I tend to give Carter more. I'm more sympathetic to Carter than DeCamp, because I feel like DeCamp knew all along what he was doing. He was the older of the pair, and he just wasn't simpatico with Howardy and Sword and Sorcery. He's a good writer otherwise, but not actually simpatico with Howardy and Sorcery. Whereas Carter very, very, very much loved it from the standpoint of a fanboy. He had a lot of strong commercial impulses too, but I don't think he's the one who was driving the whole filling in every single millisecond of Conan's life story.
Oh, okay.
I think that was more DeCamp. I mean, Carter, to the extent that it's cool to tell that story because I just get to write more, and as like comic book authors like to say, I get to play with the toys or play in the sandbox, right? And I think that's Carter's impulse. I mean, again, he did have commercial impulses. Don't get me wrong, but I think he's ultimately a fanboy, whereas I don't think DeCamp was.
Yeah, fair. And then that's why, like, I when you guys have me on your show, I did it. I guess I'll find an excuse for some reason to kind of crap on him, but it's also very lovingly because I really respect that energy that he brings. And also, I'd be lucky to have his editorial career. Jeez. But yeah, it's this kind of thing where he both frustrates and amuses the hell out of me. And as I think I've said in another recording, nobody made me buy the World's End books. His like bonkers ass He-Man style stories. So obviously I like something about him.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's just he's a kind of human figure. He's this guy that is like, what would I do if I got the opportunity to do all these things and get well paid to do it?
Well, yeah, exactly. I think anybody who's ever been unfairly critical of pastiche, for example, if you were to say to them, hey, so-and-so publisher's called right now, you get to write Conan or Batman or whoever, they'd be like, oh, awesome. Like, I don't think anybody would turn that down. And it's worth keeping it in mind, when people get a bit rough on them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, there's always that balance, but it's really obviously unpopular to talk. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. Book Twitter, a lot of people will talk about how they market their books and do all the stuff like that. But I think a lot of people just don't understand how the sausage is made as a living writer, right? I mean, a working writer. You would know some more than I do. So there are a lot of commercial considerations about, word count and, okay, I'm going to turn out maybe authors in those days. I'll go, well, I'm going to write 200 stories a year, or however much it is that I get paid to do, right? Not 200, but 50 stories a year, of which I might actually genuinely be proud of 5 of them. But 30 of them I will say, those they're as good as anything else out there, and another 15 were for the rent.
Yeah, totally. You can. I often think like, yeah, somebody needed to pay the rent this month when I'm when I'm reading some short stories. But
Right.
that's cool, man. Like, I think that's another reason why, like I say, like part of me falling in love with this stuff has been fantasizing a little bit about being a writer in like the 30s or the 60s and 70s, where like it wasn't easy. I would never say that. You know, I read too much about, say, to go outside of this stuff, Vonnegut and his struggles before he made a living from his writing, but it just seemed like there was room for doing exactly what you described in terms of writing a whole bunch of stuff and being okay with like 10 of them are my favorites, the rest whatever, I'm paying the bills. Or also the midlist in publishing was
Sure.
much more robust, and publishers would take you on for like a 3 or 4 book deal with the assumption that your first couple of books might not be that great because you're figuring it out, but whatever, let's get you out there. Whereas
Right.
I think now the margin's so much slimmer. The midlist, like the middle of almost everything in our late stage capitalist hell, has been whittled away, and there's a lot more obsession with big debuts,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
which is kind of strange. It's like expecting everybody to knock it out of the park first time is odd.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
no, it is ultimately harmful. The fact that you don't have mid list. I know that there was some commercial reasons, essentially, why I think it had to do with tax law. In all honesty, why there's not a lot of mid list paperbacks anymore because you couldn't depreciate your inventory. Um,
Oh,
so they basically was like, well, we can't print excess copies anymore, just to send out when the bookstore asks for, the distributor asks for more copies. We can't keep any in inventory, so it's in print or it's out of print. Um,
huh.
and then as far as the cheap spinner paperbacks now, I believe it was Charles Stross was mentioning that market has completely collapsed with the advent of ebooks. So now it's really doorstoppers can get printed, but 200, 300 page, pick it up in the airport book. Those are gone, right?
Oh no, the Air of the
eh,
Dad book,
yeah, right.
a quantum of violence or whatever at the airport
Right,
for like, yeah, by whoever. Yeah.
right. Um, I mean, they're there still in ebook form to a certain extent, but discoverability, just random discoverability is not there. When you're getting something for an ebook, you're actually actively questing for it, as opposed to just walking by and it catching your eye, right?
Mm.
And I guess we're reading blogs and Twitter and all this other stuff. It's not the same kind of reading, but that's it kind of fills the same sort of interstices in our lives of, oh, I've got 15 minutes, I'll hop on TMZ or doom scroll through Twitter or something like that.
Yeah, no, I definitely get way more stuff out of recommendations now than ever, and whether I'm going to the bookstore or the library, and I do kind of, even when MP3s took over music, right? I
Yeah.
remember very quickly I started to miss going through music shops and
Mm-hmm.
browsing. There's the odd one, but they're now more novelty, right? Than
Mm-hmm.
they used to be when you had HMV all over the show or whatever. Yeah, it is a different experience of discovery, and I think that's maybe why things like your podcast are very valuable, whether we're talking about the old stuff or the new stuff,
Mm-hmm.
for finding deeper thought on these works and recommendations that come from a place other than the publisher saying, please buy my thing, or the writer
Mm-hmm.
saying, please buy my thing. It's one of the things I've really enjoyed about your podcast. I've said more than once that it was your recommendation that got me to read The Red Man and others, and
Right.
then wind up befriending those authors and have them on the podcast. There
Yep.
you go, right? Nice ripple effect.
Right. And that was actually a weird thing because that was, I think it was, for some reason, August slows down in terms of the number of episodes we do. I think it's because Jeff usually goes to Gen Con, so I think he likes to take a couple of weeks off there. So I had 2 weeks in my reading schedule that I had a little break for. And I don't know how that one surfaced in my like, just, going on Amazon, and Angeline and Remco's book just kept on popping up. Like, I see. And that wasn't even with the cover that they've done now. It's like a sort of photo cover. Took a chance on it, and I'm just really glad. And then I said, oh, this is something. This is something interesting here. It's
Yeah.
the beginning of something. So
All right, I have a question I really want to make sure I get your answer on here. And I'm saying this a little tongue in cheek, of course. Why do you feel this low art, this low culture, this crapola is worthy of critical study? Because I think that's a common critique of these old things. People see Thongar and they're like, what is this garbage? But like, I obviously believe it's great and worth reading and worth thinking about. But why do you feel that way? And how do you feel about the low art, high art divide, or if it's
right.
even worth talking about?
Right. Well, in a very broad sense, before I get to sword sorcery, why not? People talk about comics. People talk about westerns. People talk about film noir. Right.
Yeah.
So why not? It's just as worthy as anything. And specifically low art, I think low art, quote unquote low art.
Yeah.
So I'm not a professional historian or anything, but my dad is a historian. So I've always had interest in history. I think low art will potentially tell you a lot more about the society and the context in which it was created than quote unquote high art, which very much may be a product of a person's singular obsessions, right? Right. Low art.
Yeah, when I think about literary genre.
Right.
Go on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so low art, well, especially now, literary fiction is all people who've gone to, creative writing MFAs or, what have you.
Yeah, what is it? Ohio is the big one in the States, or no? Which
one is it? It's not Clarion. It's the science fiction one. What's the big one? That's anyway, I don't know, but
yeah, it was like in an episode of Girls. I remember.
Right.
Anyway, go on. Sorry.
Iowa State writers.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of.
Right. And I've met a number of people who are actually, literary fiction authors who are well known and actually are pretty down to earth. But again, a lot of times it's still moving a fairly circumscribed circle, right? Even the people who didn't come out of that product are still fairly elite. In order to be that kind of writer, you have to be fairly elite, whatever society you come from. Even if you came from Vietnam or the Philippines or India, you would have to have had a secondary or college level education and all that stuff like that. So it's already disconnecting you from 80% of the daily life of your society in a way that popular fiction may or may not, right? And we know that, Robert E. Howard, as odd as he was, or maybe as an outlier as he was in his town, he was still growing up in a roughneck Texas town in the heart of the Great Depression and could see all that stuff happening outside his door and could bring some of that grittiness and sandiness and reality through the door. Yeah, and then again, the very fact that this work has very commercial reasons to exist and commercial constraints, again, tells you that, again, the art is a product of its production requirements, right? And so that's what a lot of film critics don't get. They don't get that films are made for commercial reasons and require 200, 400 people to be involved on just for the shoot, let alone the post-production, the marketing, and all of these things that go in there. So it's a miracle anything good happens. Nobody sets out to make a bad movie, right? Right.
Unless you're in some sort of the producer situation, I guess.
Right. I mean, they may have very sort of cynical impulses or not particularly thoughtful, but nobody deliberately sets out to make a terrible movie, right?
Nor a terrible, say, sword and sorcery book.
Right. It's just too much. It's just too much of your time in your life to deliberately. You may reach the limit of your talent and your gifts, but you don't deliberately say, I'm going to write the worst possible. Unless it's like some kind of elaborate performance art. Right. Right. But even then,
not a lot of Charlie Kaufmans, I don't think, out there writing these novels.
Right. But as to sword and sorcery specifically, I think what's it worth studying for? I think it did change enough times that it's worth looking at like the sword and sorcery that was produced during the Weird Tales era as opposed to the 60s. Like right there, you have two different things. And one's being written for the pulps, one's being written for the cheap paperbacks, right? Mm-hmm. And now we have the ebook phase, right? Like, what does it mean? Like, oh, this tells a lot about what publishing was like or what people were concerned about, what the anxieties people had in each specific era, right? So 30s obviously have these huge economic anxieties. You have the rise of fascism. America was a young country. There's no evidence, nobody knew for sure that America would be the great colossus that it is, post, World War II, right? So that all those anxieties. In the 60s now you have obviously the sexual revolution. You have imminent apocalypse with, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, right? Through the 80s, we have the American malaise and, and some Morning in America again. And now whatever we have this,
whatever this is,
whatever this is,
window.
Right? Yeah, Corona, authoritarian governments. So it's also fairly primal. So it can express a lot of angers and dissatisfaction. So I think sword and sorcery is pretty powerful. It could be both like representing like a yawp at like how power structures have failed us, right? And so Conan is like, yeah, what's any of this worth, right? Or just trying to get by, like Fafhrd and the Mouser, just trying to get by during the course of the day, Recently I've been rereading Michael Shea's Niftaline books.
I haven't read those. What are those like?
Yeah, those are tremendous. So definitely both the three strains I would say for sure are Clark Ashton Smith, Lieber, and Lieber. Well, anyway, those are the two strains for sure. But one thing that Michael Shea's every single one of his stories, they're very phantasmagorical. He's a thief character. So he was writing in the 80s when it was started, as you were mentioning, it was started to be all just barbarians, right? But he was writing this wiry thief character, who one of our listeners said reminded him maybe of physically of a young Iggy Pop,
Huh?
very veiny and wiry. But every single story starts with a new setting, and it actually hinges on the core economic activity of that particular setting. So one of them is in an area that's like a ranch area, and it's just all ranches and stuff like that. And then there's a passage to the underworld there. Another story is in this sort of swamp land that's ruled over by the vampire queen. And you think, oh, vampire queen, automatically she's bad, but she actually has this very prosperous kingdom, and the only price for that is once a year, sort of a la Aztec. She has a husband that once a year she basically mummifies, but then the land is and then Niftalin goes in there, and he and his partner see some kind of angle in this core economic activity in that region. And they go through these very working class set of like, okay, well, we have to get these tools together in order to do this heist. We have to dig a lot, all these things. So it's very much, so it's to me, it's fascinating. And I think he passed away about 5 years ago, but each one of his stories, like that was a thing I picked up on. I think a lot of people picked up on the sort of more phantasmagorical elements, but I was really fascinated about the sort of procedural things that Nift had to do. So I think there is room for a lot of personal expression in sword and sorcery, because maybe it's not as looked upon as highly. It gives you a little bit more leeway. I would hope. And I think that was the important thing that Brian Murphy was trying to get at with his piece yesterday, was that it's more of a filtering process rather than like putting walls around it and saying this is sword and sorcery, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was talking with Matt John of Rogues in the House, which will be the interview going out right before this. And I mentioned Brian, and have you read his book?
I have read, not all the way through, but I have it here. He was on our show, and I feel ashamed. Of course, Brian, yes. I'm sorry, I have not read it because it's so rich that I stop and take notes, and then I never move forward because I was like, oh, now I got to read those 5 books.
Well, yeah, my reading list definitely got a lot bigger when I read that. Yeah. But even if you only got a little ways in, maybe you got to the part where he lists kind of his flexible definition when he's got 7 things, and he's like, you don't have to have all 7 of these things, but if you got like 3 or 4 and it feels right, then that's sword and sorcery. And I love the idea of that flexible definition because it helps you find that sweet spot between being so rigid that it becomes just gatekeeping and the thing becomes kind of a tomb that we're maintaining, or making it so loose and floppy that like anything could be anything and it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
So if it preserves, I feel like it solves that problem of finding the middle space between those 2 points.
Right. And I think it's, he's got a very broad and analytical mind. Also, I think his training is as a journalist and rather than an academic. So he's being descriptive, right? He's looking at stuff and saying, oh, this is what people broadly agree on, and rather than like being prescriptive and saying this is sword and sorcery and
we could fill a lot of time with like what is it, but yeah, so I'm going to force a segue here. So we're talking about being descriptive. There we go, Oliver, good one. What have been your personal experiences with creative writing?
I wrote a little bit in high school. We had a lot of English classes and opto classes, and also I went to film school, so did screenwriting there. Never really good. I don't have the ability just to force myself through and get out of my head and say this is that character and it's not me so there's always that Mary Sue problem, right? So I appreciate what I see, and I don't. I mean, I suppose all writers have the same doubts, and then just frankly, I just never had to make a living at it, so so it just never like forced me to get any deeper in there. But listening to your podcast, I'm like, okay, I have these ideas that kind of percolate in my head. Will they ever turn into a thing? Or I played a lot of D&D. Maybe that's where that impulse just gets released. It's like by being a dungeon master. Character is fascinating. World building is both great and a problem. I think a lot of fantasy right now is too top down in the world building. They've been told you have to like create a perfect magic system. You have to have like all the societal issues worked out in advance, like how all the societies. I see you're nodding your head and frowning too.
Yeah, sorry, listeners, you can't see me, but I'm kind of shaking my head a little bit in agreement and sort of dismay.
So world building, I think, it's like almost a demand now. I see this, and people are really struggling with it, writing epic fiction, right? The big doorstopper fantasy novels. You have to like completely have worked out the world, the magic system, and that's like what people are hanging up, right? Like, oh, well, that magic system was already done by such and such author, so I have to do something completely different. And this is the beauty of Swords and Sorcery, right? You don't have to explain to anyone how the magic system works. We just know that it's bad. Don't use it.
Like it's
don't
a dark and terrible thing that can corrupt you with time, almost certainly.
Right.
Yeah.
and just create hints, drop hints about what this world is. Again, I keep on harking back to Ken and Robin, but they're very wise men in the gaming world. Ken Hite, who knows more about any kind of obscure history fact that you can think of, always says there's nothing more interesting than the real world. Anything that you think is weird is not possibly as weird as something that's happened in the real world. So just reskin that, or just even drop it in the
Well, it worked for Margaret Atwood, right? I mean, Handmaid's Tale, famously, she likes to say, like, everything in it's happened in some combination, And you're making me think of RPG books in a way because like when you're reading those novels where it's the top-down magic system, etc., it's like, are you here for a novel or are you here for the classic RPG splat book, setting book?
And I know there's a whole new genre, lit RPG, which is basically, fiction that is directly, you could sort of map one-to-one to some sort of gaming. You may not know what people actually are saying, that the Game of Thrones came out of George R.R. Martin's GURPS game, which now seems kind of plausible.
Really? That's interesting. And I used to run GURPS. I didn't get a franchise out of it.
Right. And who's the other one? Steven Erikson, again, a fellow Canadian, right? He was also famously a major GURPS gamer. And I think that whole series came out of the world building that he and his Ian Esselmont did. And that was ultimately built upon to create the whole, the whole series there. So that very much, and that's an understandable impulse, especially if you're a dungeon master or something like that. It's like, I just want to put all the pieces in order, right? But and that was something that I had really struggled with for a long time, and that's probably what would be a block on a lot of people's writing. It's like, I got to do all this before I can even get to the story, right? I think you've alluded to something similar to that, right?
Yeah, I think I wish more people would get into the idea of the vomit draft, where you just throw something down. You can always edit it later. You can always knock over your pen while you're recording. Whoops. Just throw it down, man. And figure out the details later if you even feel you need to.
Right. Yeah. Now, to the extent that I've done anything successful, which is mostly, I would say, like at this point, the show notes or the couple pieces I did for Goodman Games, it's really
I wanted to ask you about that. Your really great articles for their Adventures in Fiction series. How did that come about?
I think it was pretty, Joseph liked what, our podcast, and he asked Jeff to do one, piece there because, they had a lot of them coming up. And then he mentioned some, blah, blah, blah. And then Jeff said, I can do this one. And I said, I really don't know anything about this other author. And then he recommended me, and then Joseph approached me. And, I always take it right up to the deadline. I took it right up to the 1,000-word limit. Well, actually, usually 1,500 and bring it right back to 999 words because,
I was going to ask what's your process like writing these, but I think I get the idea.
Right. Well, the one thing that it usually hinges on, I'm terrible at outlining. I feel it sucks all the life out for me personally, out of trying to write something. So for me, oddly enough, with anything, it usually starts with, whether it's a game, whether it starts with just a phrase, a sentence, an image, and it's like, okay, I need to I need to get to that point where that image, I need to somehow write up to that scene or to that image. I need to do everything that gets me to that scene, right, or to that image. So I think with short stories, I think they could, again, let's use the example of the cover of one of the Frazetta covers. Assuming that Conan, Robert E. Howard had never written the Conan stories, but you had all these Frazetta covers, right? How would you write to get to that scene where Conan is wrestling the ape in the red cape?
Yeah.
Right. Like what leads to that? What leads to that image? Right. What leads to that image of Conan fighting the two frost giants? Right. Or so for, to the extent if I ever get back in writing, I have like an image or two, that it's like, okay, how will I get to this image? I have this image of, essentially fantasy soldiers out of Stalingrad. Well, how did they get there?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think it's a great way to do it. And both my first and second novel came out of, I obviously had some ideas and themes swirling around in my head that were waiting for the match to strike kind of thing. But the match that struck in both cases was me seeing a photo and going, like, what's that person's story? And then I wrote the book.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. And to the extent of the nonfiction pieces, it's like, well, here's this really interesting factoid that I want, but I can't be just doing a listicle. Right. And so how do I lead to this interesting thing that I've learned about Jack Williamson or Lynn Carter? So Jack Williamson, the most interesting thing I found, tons of interesting things, but the fact that he literally grew up like one of the last the Wild West pioneers in the high desert in New Mexico, and they had, he had scorpions and snakes in his house, and, right? His family went out there on a covered wagon, right?
That's so cool. I wonder, have you heard of or maybe even read Ed Brubaker? He got a comic trade out last year called Pulp.
I did, actually. It was your recommendation that I think you wrote somewhere, and I saw.
Yeah, I probably did because I couldn't shut up about it. Yeah, no, I picked it up, read it, went wow, and then went back to the first page. Like I did that. So there you go. Right. I wonder if he was thinking of him when he wrote it.
Yeah. So just like an image somewhere in there, right? Or again, so even with nonfiction, okay. Or sometimes I'll just like fall in love with some stupid sentence I wrote. It's like, okay, well, how do I justify this sentence, and how do I get to that sentence?
Right? Yeah, I've been there.
Like this one phrase has been tickling in my brain, and so how do I get to that sentence? Or I have a name for a character. Well, who's this character? Right? I just have a name. What is this character? Who is this character? Or some little phrase.
I love it. Well, hey, man, I mean, no pressure, but if you ever do find yourself writing short fiction, you've got a beta reader in me if you want.
Oh, there you go. Great.
Yeah.
I mean, I do want to mention, I haven't read very deeply, but there's Jason Ray Carney's doing that Whetstone, which is open.
Yeah, I've been all over their Discord. Sorry, go on. Whetstone?
Yeah. And now he's got a cosmic horror one too, right? The something window.
Yeah. I can't remember, but I'll dig it up and put it in the show notes.
Right. So I mean, there's still venues. Obviously, the question is getting paid.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, short stories. Except for I don't even know what the best markets pay because they tend to be a bit more coy or whatever. But like, yeah, you're not making a living on short stories right now, but you maybe get a little bit of money that you can invest in yourself. You might get enough money to pay a story editor to go through your next story to help polish it and hopefully level up into the next bigger paying market. Treat it like a video game, maybe less like a career with the short stories. But also they help build credibility. Like I'm, focused on this novel, but I'm also working on a short story. I'm hoping to maybe get into the next issue of Tales. We'll see what happens from the Magician's Skull, because I want, first of all, I love the magazine. I want to get a story in it, but also I want to build that brick road of credibility of short stories to hopefully help me sell the novel, as well as point to the podcast audience, which will be huge, I hope, by that point. Yeah. So, okay, we're getting around the hour point here, and I want to, if only to honor what you and Jeff do, try and keep it to that length. So I just want to close out. Do you and Jeff have any long-term plans for the podcast? Like maybe you guys would co-write a book on the Appendix N or something?
I think we started the podcast to avoid writing something. I don't know. I guess Jeff is finishing up school and starting a new career, so I don't know exactly where that will take him at the moment. I would love to get these thoughts together in something, but I don't know. Like, so many people are doing such a great job. Like Brian Murphy again, a bunch of other people who've really done the scholarship. Again, Jason Ray Carney, a bunch of other people. So I think our strength is in the sort of conversational nature of just, meeting interesting people and talking about it. And I'm not sure that would work as well on the page. I'm not saying I'm not open to it, but how do I clear the decks to do something like that? In addition to DMing, day job, the 4 to 6 hours of sleep I get, or whatever. And that's not something to be proud of either. You really want, I really function best on 7, but sometimes it's 4 to 6. So
wow, I hear you. Plus, I mean, a lot of us are having insomnia right now. Good old pandemic. Yeah. I'm with you.
But yeah, I mean, I guess it's an interesting question, because is anything, we like to think of the written word as this thing, it's permanent, but is it any more ephemeral or less ephemeral than any other medium at this point? It's all digital, which means one bad flipped digit could just destroy everything at this point. But on the other hand, we see libraries deaccessioning their collections like every day. Thankfully the Merrill doesn't, but but everybody
that's one of the
else.
reasons why I'm so grateful for special archives, because at least there you can find certain things. Yeah. No.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's just this is again, like I've said, I don't have any like grander ambitions to springboard into turning this into a gaming career. If someone came to me and said, "Hey, yes, we want you to do the next Goodman Games box set," or something like that, I'd be like, "Okay, well, all right, what are we talking about?"
Please do a Lynn Carter World's End box set for Goodman Games. I would pick that up in a heartbeat.
Right. I mean, it is very DCC, right? That one definitely could work. So yeah, I don't know. I should talk to Jeff about that and see what he. I mean, our original list was 290 books, which we thought would take us 5 years, but now when we last looked at it, we realized it would take us over 10 years at the pace we were going. And
Is
now,
that why you guys made the switch at 100?
no, actually, it
to
wasn't.
go to.
Well, not so much from my part. For Jeff, I think he was starting to get burned out, specifically on seeing some of the sort of the lower tier titles, and my only frustration was by the nature of how we set it up. We couldn't read like all of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Not that you would want to read all 75 of his books, but we were like still a long way from getting to John Carter, which I was like, okay, well, it may or may not be his best book, but it's his most seminal book, but it's still like 3 years out, right? Right on this list. Or, okay, well, we read tomorrow, we hadn't read tomorrow at that point, but we read this great book, but we can't read the sequel for another 6 months, and that's kind of makes things very choppy. So I'm actually happy. I think I always want to stay in the vein of, Appendix N, but the fact that it opens up the format a little bit, and I think most of our listeners are still going to want books that are of that era or directly related so far, but it still opens it up for us. And I've managed to read 3 or 4 books that, I would not have read otherwise, or have much accelerated up onto my list of like my opportunity to read, like, okay, well, I'll finally get to read some Gene Wolfe soon, so that's great. Imaro had been on my, I need to read this, but now it's, especially with Saunder's passing last year, I was like, oh, it's really important that I read this now. And
and the listener spoke and said, please read it. So there you go.
Right. So, so that's kind of where we're at. But I definitely, some of the major works that are on there, I want to make sure that we still get, in the queue. So
I'm sorry. Go on.
We may call an audible on a couple of those books. Say, okay, this one's not up for vote. We're just going to read, Princess of Mars if we don't get to it by, 2022.
Well, I think you got to do that sometimes. As a GM, I pull out a bunch of index cards, and each one is like this adventure, that adventure, go this way to my players. But one of them says GM's choice, and once in a while, I just point at that one and go, that one. That's what we're doing. Sometimes you just got to grab the ore and be like, democracy's fine, but sometimes no.
Right. Right. I mean, we could go into a whole discussion about DMing philosophy, but that's another podcast. But
yeah, I mean, I would love to, but yeah. And also, my apologies if I was kind of trying to. I keep seeing this wretched phrase lately, the grind set. It's like the mindset of the grind. You're always going to be producing more, doing more things. What's the next thing? What's the next thing? When like you're already doing something wonderful with the Appendix N Book Club podcast. So yeah, I mean, if that's all if that's all in quotation marks, all you guys ever did, I would be so happy. But of course, there's always that thing as a fan where you're like, oh, I also want to get like the lunchbox and the,
Well, I mean, I think we have one of our listeners, Rick Byrne. He's an amazing graphic designer or logo designer. So he designed our new logo, and he's like, hey, some of the stuff could work as merch or something like that. I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. It's not something I would love for people to have stuff like that. I just don't want to manage any kind of inventory and be doing order fulfillment. So it would have to be one of those like on demand, type situations.
Yeah, I've been there with Kickstarters in the past. Woof.
Yeah. So yeah, but I mean, I would love to always talk to more people. I don't go to cons, or at least I haven't been to any up to the date. But if someone's like, oh, come down to North Texas and blather off for a while and meet some of these other people, I'm like, okay, sure, why not? Right? Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that we get. But the main thing to me is just getting to meet all these people, even if it's just kind of virtually through the show. So that's been really, really incredible. And
I'm really early on with this thing, and I love the fact that I'm getting to talk to people I've enjoyed listening to, such as yourself. And I will talk forever, but then I will have to edit all of it. So I think unless there's anything else you really want to sneak in here about where people can find you, that kind of thing, before we go.
Sure. The podcast is Appendix N Book Club, so it's appendixnbookclub.com, or you can find us on Twitter at appendix_N. That's probably the best way to find us. And give us a listen and let us know if you like us and if we're doing okay. And if you're really, really into it, then you can join our Patreon. But everybody gets the show, so we don't hold anything back there. So.
No, but for as little as $1 a month, you can be. I mean this, but they always go into the kind of that TV voice. For as little as $1 a month, you can be a member and have a say in voting what books they comment on and join discussions. I think it's a great Patreon.
Thank you, appreciate it. So yeah, that's it, and we'll see you guys out there, guys, gals, and everybody else out there.
Cheers! Thanks so much for coming by, man. It's been great.
All right, thank you so much.
So I'm writing a novel, features original music by Gloria Guns, and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to submit a question, then please email it to soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. Bonus points if you record yourself and send me an MP3 I can cut into the show. Doesn't have to be fancy, using your phone is fine, just keep it clear and concise. You can also holler at the show on Twitter. Look for @so_writing. That's @so_writing. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, leaving a review on iTunes, and checking out patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Patrons get to be thanked in the final novel, listen to episodes of the podcast a week early, and even enjoy a bonus podcast called So I Wrote a Novel, where I read and comment on chapters of previous works, starting with my first novel, Junkyard Leopard. Thanks for hanging out with me, and hoi, and I'll see you soon.